Today on The World Today. Chad's President Idriss Déby dies on the front lines of fighting insurgents in the country. The United States warns against travel to 80% of countries worldwide because of the coronavirus pandemic. Plus, the jury is yet to deliver its decision on the Derek Chauvin trial on the murder of George Floyd. Well, let's get right into it. Chadian military president Idriss Déby has died. The warrior president, who clung to power for 39 years, was killed while he visited troops battling rebels who had launched a major incursion last week from their base in Libya. He had been set to lead the country for a sixth term after securing a huge lead in provisional results announced on Monday.
Fidèle au serment fait à la nation et au peuple tchadien,
Army spokesman Azim Agouana announced the death of Chadian President Idriss Déby in a broadcast on state television. Surrounded by a group of military officers he referred to as the National Council of Transition.
Ce douloureux événement intervient le jour.
The government and parliament have been dissolved, and a military council, headed by General Mohamed Idriss Déby Itno, the son of the deceased Chadian leader, will govern for the next 18 months. 68-year-old President Déby is said to have died from injuries sustained while visiting troops on the front line of a fight against northern rebels. President Déby, one of Africa's longest ruling leaders, came to power in a rebellion in 1990. On Monday, provisional results from the election on April the 11th projected he would win a sixth term in office with nearly 80% of the vote. The vote was boycotted by opposition leaders. At a planned celebration in the capital, N'Djamena, supporters waited for the president to deliver a victory speech, but his party said he had instead gone to visit Chadian soldiers battling rebels from a group calling itself FACT, the Front for Change and Concord in Chad, who had launched a major incursion into the north of the country on Election Day. The president had in the past joined the country's soldiers in the front line of the fight against Boko Haram terrorists. Mr. Déby was a long-time ally of France and other Western powers in the battle against jihadist groups in the Sahel region of Africa. In 2014, following the abduction of 223 schoolgirls in northeastern Nigeria, at a security summit in Paris, heads of state of Cameroon, Niger, Chad, Benin and Nigeria met to discuss a medium to long-term plan on sharing surveillance information, intelligence and military resources in the fight against Boko Haram. Taking a hard stance, President Idriss Déby declared that it would be total war. And just last month, he was in Nigeria to visit President Muhammadu Buhari, where they deliberated on sub-regional issues, including security challenges occasioned by the activities of Boko Haram. However, there has been growing unhappiness over his government's management of Chad's oil resources. During the election, he campaigned on a platform of bringing peace and security to the region.
French President Emmanuel Macron has become the first global leader to react to the death of the Chadian president. President Macron released a statement from his office in which he deplored President Déby's death and took note of a creation of an interim military body, urging a quick return to civilian rule and a peaceful transition. He also likened President Déby's death to the loss of a brave friend, saying, quote, "It expresses its strong attachment to Chad's stability and territorial integrity." President Déby was at the forefront of his country's fight against insurgency. He was said to be anything but an armchair general. He had gone to the front line several kilometers north of N'Djamena, the Chadian capital, at the weekend to visit troops battling rebels belonging to a group that calls itself the Front for Change and Concord in Chad, FACT for short. Security analyst David Otto a while ago spoke to my colleague Layo Adegoke on the impact his death will have on the war against insurgency.
There are two things that have happened in Chad, and we're just talking about the death of Idriss Deby. What we've also seen is that there has been something that looks more or less like a coup d'etat. The Chadian constitution clearly states that in the event that the president dies or is incapacitated, it is the Speaker of the National Assembly that is supposed to take over from the president. Now, what we've seen is that the military has set up a military council and appointed the son of Idriss Deby as the interim president. So we've got the military regime in place, and that is the immediate impact, of the demise of Idriss Deby, and that will also have a much ripple effect, not just on the political instability that Chad will face or that Chad is facing, but it's also going to have a ripple effect on the region itself. Idriss Deby, as you rightly mentioned, was a strong man. He was seen as one of the bedrocks that held the Sahel and also the Lake Chad Basin, in some level of stability. Because remember, Chad is one of the countries that was both in the G5 Sahel coalition and also in the multinational joint task force. So the absence of Idriss Deby will have a much bigger impact, especially with Libya being very unstable. So countries like Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger will have to really sit tight and come up with a strategy to deal with the instability that was coming from Chad or that Chad used to cushion. But also, I think it's important for our audience to know that whoever is going to take over from Idriss Deby will have a huge task because he was, a very strong man and has been there, as you rightly said, since 1990.
A microbiologist at Cambridge University who leads the UK's gene sequencing efforts to track COVID-19 variants, Professor Sharon Peacock, says it is too early to say if the variant seen in India is to blame for its rising infection rate. She explains that the major surge seen in the country may be simply due to human behavior, or it may be the variant, or it could be a mix of the two. Professor Peacock says the South African variant, which can partially evade the immune response from vaccination or earlier infections, is the one causing the most concern. Here's the global update.
While the UK worries about the coronavirus variant in the country, the number of cases in India continues to rise. More than 273,810 new cases have been reported in the past 24 hours, marking the highest ever single-day spike since the outbreak started in the country. The newly added cases have pushed the nation's total tally beyond 15 million infections, and the country's death toll reached nearly 179,000. Government-held parts of Yemen have begun to receive their first shot of COVID-19 vaccine 3 weeks after the first shipment from the global COVAX vaccine sharing scheme arrived in the country. On March 31st, Yemen received 360,000 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, part of a consignment from COVAX expected to total 1.9 million doses this year. Lockdown measures in the Netherlands are expected to be eased from next week as pressure to reopen society mounts despite still high coronavirus infection rates. A nationwide nighttime curfew that has been in place for 3 months will be lifted on April 28th, and bars and restaurants will be allowed to gradually reopen next week. Authorities in New Zealand have reported that a worker in Auckland Airport has tested for COVID-19, but doubt whether the new case would warrant ordering a pause in quarantine-free travel with Australia. Australia and New Zealand opened a travel bubble on Monday, April 19, after both countries had closed borders in March last year to non-citizens and permanent residents to contain the pandemic. In other news, Europe's drug regulator, the EMA, says it has found a possible link between Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine and rare blood clotting issues in adults who had received the shot in the United States. The European Medicines Agency says its safety committee concluded that a warning about unusual blood clots with low blood platelets should be added to the vaccine's labels. Finally, the World Health Organization's Emergency Committee has recommended that proof of vaccination not be required as a condition of international travel, maintaining its stance on the issue under growing debate. The independent experts, in a statement issued on Monday, cited limited evidence on whether vaccination against COVID-19 reduces people's ability to transmit the virus and the persistent inequity in global vaccine distribution. The panel says states should recognize that requiring proof of vaccination deepens inequities and promotes unequal freedom of movement.
The U.S. State Department has sent out travel advice to citizens warning against travel to 80% of countries in the world due to the coronavirus. It said its decision to update the advisory is to bring it more in line with those from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and does not imply a reassessment of the current health situation in a given country. The current U.S. Do Not Travel Advisory covers 34 out of 200 countries. And with more than 3 million lives around the world lost to the coronavirus, more than half of the number is in the United States. Joining us now is foreign policy expert Joanna LeBlanc, and she joins us from Washington. Joanna, thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So, how do you think this advisory by the State Department reflects on America's relations globally, seeing that 80% of the world is off limits for Americans?
I don't think it's a reflection of the U.S.'s relationship with nations globally in general. And here's why. The State Department has an obligation to U.S. citizens to inform them of potential threats when traveling abroad. Yes, you are correct. While most of the infections are right here in the United States. And as we know, with the African continent and many Caribbean nations, the infection rate is relatively low. Even that fact, the U.S. government has to take into consideration if a U.S. citizen were to travel to those nations and were to get infected or sick, what are the health infrastructures in place to accommodate them? So all of that is taken into consideration when determining which countries are safe to travel and not safe to travel. So the advisory is mainly for U.S. citizens to ensure their safety when they're traveling abroad, because the U.S. has an obligation, and some would even argue a legal obligation as well, because you will see there's a discrepancy between the CDC's advisory and the State Department's advisory, because the State Department has a much greater role in protecting its U.S. citizens abroad.
And internally, how much do Americans really want to travel? Because whether we like it or not, vaccine passports are becoming a real thing, despite the advisory from the World Health Organization that it encourages inequity in countries where there isn't a large vaccine campaign because they have limited doses.
Well, I do think in general, Americans want to travel just like the rest of people around the world. We have been in this pandemic mode for the past year. People want to get out. People want to travel. People want to see the world. People have saved money because they have not been able to travel as much, right? But at the same token, there are some precautions that are in place, and Americans have to take heed to that. But I do agree with your argument about the inequities in vaccine distribution. Studies came out that show that most African nations will not be able to vaccinate its population until 2023, which is in a sense very problematic, because yes, the United States is highly infected in comparison to African nations and other nations in the Caribbean, but I think there needs to be equity in terms of vaccine distribution. And furthermore, it is in the national security interest of the United States government and other rich nations to ensure that low and middle income countries also have access to the vaccine, because we are not safe until all of us are safe. And secondly, I do believe that there is a room for rich nations to consider providing assistance to low and middle income countries to strengthen their health infrastructures in order to be able to better respond to pandemics in the future. Because it's not a matter of if we'll have another pandemic, it's a matter of when.
All right. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for joining us on the program today, and do stay safe out there.
Thank you very much.
Still to come on the program. It's Queen Elizabeth's birthday tomorrow. She turns 95, and this one will be very low-key. You know why. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Everyone, literally everyone, is waiting on the jury in the Derek Chauvin trial of George Floyd's murder in the United States. A while ago, Floyd's aunt and cousin say they are hoping for a guilty verdict as the jury continues to deliberate. Now, bear in mind, the judge told them yesterday there are no transcripts of the trial, so they would have to depend on notes taken during the trial. They are also allowed to ask questions regarding any of the testimonies given. Yesterday, the prosecution and the defense held their closing arguments. The prosecution again emphasizing Chauvin did not have to use force on Floyd since he was already on the ground. And again referring to the eyewitness video showing Chauvin with his knee on Floyd's neck and hearing Floyd saying he cannot breathe. The defense carried on with Floyd's history of drug abuse and how that was a factor in his death. The jury have to go over arguments made over the 11 days of trial over the testimony of 38 witnesses in the court and remain objective in the case. We do not envy the jurors in this case. Working with just their notes, they have to recollect hours and hours of testimonies. Even we have to juggle our memories to recollect everything said during the trial. Here are a few that we remember.
Swear or affirm that you will be attentive during this trial and follow the instructions of the court so that you may reach a fair and just verdict.
You will learn that on May 25th of 2020, Mr. Derek Chauvin betrayed this badge when he used excessive and unreasonable force upon the body of Mr. George Floyd. That he put his knees upon his neck and his back, grinding and crushing him until the very breath, no, ladies and gentlemen, until the very life were squeezed out of him.
When I look at George Floyd, I look at my dad, I look at my brothers, I look at my cousins, my uncles, because they are all black. I have a black father, I have a black brother, I have black friends. And I look at that and I look at how that could have been one of them. It's been nights I stayed up apologizing and apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more and not physically interacting and not saving his life. But it's like, it's not what I should have done. It's what he should have done. He should have.
That's the answer.
Our correspondent in Washington, Maria Bird, joins us now. Maria, thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a nail-biting moment in the nation that it's going through as they await the jury, which is still deliberating. Describe to us what they could be going over and the kinds of conversations that they're having as we speak.
You're exactly correct. This is the entire country is waiting and watching. We know that police departments across the U.S. have increased the number of police that are actually available to work over the next couple of days, anticipating that if anything does happen, they will have the appropriate amount of support to address it. We know that President Biden has also come out just a few moments ago and spoken on the issue. He has avoided and not said much about the trial due to the fact that he did not want to have any impact on the jurors, but now they are sequestered, so they are removed from any sort of media information at this time. And so this is a moment that is, been called a reckoning. And I think that we're going to truly see a reckoning happen once the verdict is released.
And Maria, is there a time frame for their deliberations? And I want to look again at both argument sides that they had yesterday. The prosecution told the jury to believe their eyes, referring, of course, to the eyewitness videos of Chauvin putting his knee on Floyd's neck, and the defense chose to continue to harp on his drug use. How have Americans been processing all of this?
Americans are again focusing on, I think, what the prosecution has said, the 9 minutes, the, knee on the neck, and what has been stated by the prosecution several times, excessive use of force by a police officer. And so I think that's the piece that Americans are kind of looking at. Now, has there been conversations around the drug use? Yes, of course. But I think that's really, Americans are looking at that as a potential risk in the situation, and that maybe Mr. Floyd was under the influence. But whether or not that has anything to do with the death of Mr. Floyd, I think many Americans have not necessarily put that as a reason for the death of Mr. Floyd. And so, as you said, both the prosecution and defense have stayed true to their pieces. We know that the jurors are deliberating, and it could take a couple of days. It really depends on if we know that there are 5 men and 7 women. And we know that at this time, they are typically it's done by straws. And if they all do not agree, and if there's some information that needs to be discussed, that's most likely what's happening at this time, is they're trying to come to a consensus. And remember, too, there's 3 charges against Derek Chauvin. And so when you talk about the 3 charges, you're looking at second-degree murder charges, which is unintentional killing of someone. You're looking at third-degree murder charges, and you're also looking at second-degree manslaughter charges. So it's several charges that are being brought against the defendant in this case. And so those are all the pieces that the jury is trying to put together at this time.
And Maria, I have been observing the reactions and the concerns that center around a repetition of the Rodney King trial in 1994. How similar or different could this be to that?
We're hopeful. Obviously, the Rodney King, was a massive outbreak in the mid 90s across the United States, but obviously really focused in the West, in the California region. But we know that this is something that has taken the world by storm. And so the request is that whether or not it's a guilty or a innocent verdict that comes forth, that peaceful protests are at the forefront at all times. And the president of the U.S. has asked for that. The members of the family of George Floyd have asked for that, even though they're, have said that they don't see any other way that this case could go other than a guilty verdict. But we're hopeful that it does not lead to additional looting, does not lead to burning down of any businesses in the communities, as many have suffered so much as a result of the pandemic. And so the hope is that people will begin to have peaceful protests. But I think it's just a real wait and see moment in the U.S.
Definitely. Well, we will be watching closely. Thanks again, Maria, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And finally on the program, our congratulations go out to Queen Elizabeth, who turns 95 on April 21st. It will be her first birthday without her beloved husband, Prince Philip, who was laid to rest on Saturday, April 17th at St. George's Chapel and Windsor Castle. The Duke of Edinburgh, who had been at her side throughout her record-breaking 69-year reign, died at Windsor Castle on April 9th at the age of 99. The royal family are in a period of mourning, which continues until Thursday the 22nd, 2 weeks after Philip's death. Her birthday will pass without the traditional gun salutes in Hyde Park and the Tower of London for the second time. The Queen asked that there be no gun salutes for her 94th birthday last year, as she did not feel it appropriate in light of the coronavirus crisis. Well, happy birthday again to the Queen. That's all we have for the program. I'm Akaite Afia. Have a great evening and stay safe.